Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. This show is going to be seen on the last week of December and the first week of January, so it seems the appropriate time for me to engage in a sort of holiday tradition around here and put aside heavy-duty politics in favor of addressing two burning questions. One, why is Christmas Day on December 25th as opposed to any other day of the year? And why is New Year's Day January 1st as opposed to any other day of the year? Now, first, to answer about Christmas, about why it's on December 25th as opposed to in June or something, right at the top you have to realize something. Based on how we celebrate the season, based on how we, and by that I mean Americans and perhaps to an even greater extent Europeans, how we engage and embrace the season, the traditions we follow in our celebrations, have to realize that this is Christmas. This is Christmas, and so is this, and this, along with, you know, mistletoe and holly and candy canes or whatever local traditions you might have. But this is not. Because you know those people who go around saying that Jesus is the reason for the season? He's not, and he never was. Now that half of you are composing nasty emails, let me try to explain. The season is because of astronomical patterns. Until relatively recently, people were much more aware of the movement of the sun and the moon and the stars than we are today, unless you're either a dedicated stargazer or an astronomer. Observing such movements, they had necessary signs of the changing of the seasons, of when to plant, when to reap, when seasonal rains were coming, when game might be plentiful, and so on and so on. The sky was their almanac. It was their seasonal calendar. Now, some of that awareness lives on in popular expressions in mythology. For one example, did you ever wonder why the hot days of summer are sometimes still called the dog days? Well, ancient peoples, by their observations, were able to realize that the star which we call Sirius, which was at its highest and brightest in the middle of the night in the middle of winter, was at its highest and brightest in the middle of the day in the middle of summer. Sirius is the brightest star in the night sky in the northern hemisphere, and it's in the constellation Canis Major, or the Big Dog, and it's known as the Dog Star. So the hot days of summer became the days of the dog days. In prehistoric times, and even well into recorded history, people believed that things like the sun acted willfully, or were controlled by gods that acted willfully. And each year, watching it sink lower and lower in the sky every day as winter approached, a fear developed that one of those years, one of those great cycles, at some point the sun would just keep sinking until it disappeared below the horizon, leaving the people in perpetual cold and darkness. So each year, when the sun stopped sinking and started to rise higher and higher each day, it was a cause to celebrate. This is the time of the winter solstice, the beginning of winter, or if you want to be technically correct, it's the December solstice, since in the southern hemisphere it's the beginning of summer. But it occurs, depending upon exactly where you are, on December 21st or December 22nd. Solstice is derived from two Latin words, sol and sistere, which together mean the sun stands still, which is what it appears to do at the solstice. Every day the sun has been getting lower and lower in the sky. At the solstice, it stops doing that and starts to climb higher and higher in the sky each day, bringing with it the promise of a return of spring. So all over the northern hemisphere, this was a time to celebrate. China had celebrations. Egypt had celebrations, as did ancient Greece. In fact, in the earliest days, their celebrations included a human sacrifice. The Druids celebrated. It was celebrated in Iran. Native American peoples of North America, including the Hopi and the Pueblo, had their celebrations. In pagan Scandinavia, the winter festival was called the Yule. Great Yule logs were burned. People sat around drinking mead around bonfires, listening to tales of great deeds in the past. A boar was sacrificed to the chief god Odin, who donned a broad-brimmed hat and a magic blue cloak and sped around the world at night on his great white horse. Mistletoe, which was a sacred plant because it grew on the most sacred tree, which was the oak, was cut, and a spray was given to each family to hang in their doorway as a sign of good luck. Now, this is our first reminder that a lot of our holiday traditions, including the term Yuletide, time of the Yule, are drawn from pagan ones, including decorating with garlands, wreaths, the Christmas tree itself, along with the man who could magically fly around the entire world in the course of one night. For the date of Christmas, however, now we're getting into the space that lies between history and interpretation. While historians are confident they can date the birth of Jesus, the year of his birth, to at least within a couple of years, no one knows the day of the year Jesus was born, or even the season. To the extent the Bible can be trusted as source, we can actually be confident that he was not born in the winter, since shepherds did not watch their flocks by night at that time of year. The flocks would very likely have been corralled. In fact, watching their flocks by night was usually done in the spring, when the flocks would be pastured and newborn lambs needed special protection against wolves. Now, this has led some people to argue that Jesus must have been born in the spring, but that's an awfully thin reed on which to build a foundation, much less a conclusion. What's more, now, the earliest known use in English of the word Christmas, Feast of Christ, Christmas, was in a list of feast days with mass days that was set down in England in 1038, more than 1,000 years after Jesus died, and no saint's day is listed for December 25th. Indeed, early church leaders, and I'm talking 2nd and 3rd centuries here, they actually argued about when Jesus was born. The options included January 2nd, March 21st, March 25th, April 18th, April 19th, May 20th, May 28th, November 17th, November 20th, and yes, December 25th. And at the same time, some, such as Origen of Alexandria, argued that the whole thing was pointless and wrong because it shouldn't be celebrated at all. Celebrating birthdays, he said, was for pagan gods. Still, by the middle of the 3rd century, the idea for having a day to celebrate the birth of Jesus was getting established. Nonetheless, it took another 100 years for the idea to become formalized and for a day to be set. Meanwhile, in 313, Constantine the Great issued his Edict of Milan, legally allowing Christianity in the Roman Empire. In fact, the edict went considerably beyond that. The text actually says it was proper that the Christians and all others should follow that mode of religion which to each of them appeared best, which frankly shows a lot more tolerance than a lot of people do today. Oh, and as a sidebar, and contrary to popular belief, while Constantine considered himself an emperor of the Christian people, he did not formally convert by being baptized until shortly before his death in 337, and Christianity did not become the official religion of Rome until 380, 43 years after he died. All right, but getting back to the point, the earliest known reference to Jesus being born on December 25th doesn't come until the first years of the 3rd century. That's about 175 years after he died. The first recorded date of his birth actually being celebrated on December 25th was not until 336. And it wasn't until the year 350 when Pope Julius I officially declared that the birth of Jesus would be celebrated on the 25th of December. But that just brings us back to the start. Why did the chosen date come down to December 25th? I mean, that was the question. All right, to answer that, first remember that these events are taking place in Rome, which by then was the nerve center of organized Christianity. And that brings us back in turn to the winter solstice. The Romans, like many other ancient peoples, had solstice celebrations. In Rome, it was called Saturnalia. Now, this is originally a feast day to the god Saturn, but over time it grew into a large-scale fair and festival of the home. It began with the sacrifice of a pig. It involved riotous merrymaking, feasting, and gambling. Houses were decorated with laurels and evergreens. Schools were closed. The army rested. No prisoners were executed. Friends visited one another, bringing good luck gifts of fruit and cakes, candles, dolls, jewelry, incense, and other such things. Temples were decorated with evergreens. Processions of people danced through the streets with blackened faces or wearing masks and wearing fantastic hats. Masters feasted with slaves who could say and do what they pleased, at least hypothetically. I mean, I doubt they felt very free to push the privilege very far, since, you know, in not long in the future, they'd be right back to being just slaves again. But, you know, at least hypothetically they could. And now, notice, by the way, again, traditions including decorating your home, laurels, visiting friends, gift giving, holiday parties. These are not Christian traditions. They were Roman ones, pagan ones. Now, the old Roman goddess of the solstice was Angerona, whose festival day, logically enough for a goddess of the solstice, was December 21st. But when Mithraism, personified by the god Mithra, was introduced to Rome in the mid-2nd century, the goddess was largely supplanted in favor of Mithra's day of seasonal rebirth, which was December 25th. Mithra, himself a composite of earlier beliefs, became amalgamated with a Roman sun god named Solus Indigeni, or the native sun, a god which in turn came from an early Greek titan of light named Helios. This new being, this combination of Mithra and Solus Indigeni, this composite of two composites, was Sol Invictus, the invincible or unconquerable sun. Mithra's day, December 25th, became Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, or the birthday of the unconquerable sun. When the Emperor Aurelian proclaimed Mithraism the official religion of the Roman Empire in 274, the day became an official holiday. So, put it all together. Before Constantine issued his Edict of Milan, that was in 313 again, being a Christian in Rome could get you killed. Refusal to participate in the imperial cult was considered treason. During the Great Persecution carried out by the Emperor Diocletian from 303 to 311, Christian buildings and the homes of Christians were torn down. Their sacred books were collected and burned. Christians themselves were arrested, tortured, mutilated, burned, starved, and condemned to gladiatorial contests for the amusement of spectators. So, if you wanted to celebrate the birth of the man you regarded as your savior, and the idea of having such a celebration was by then pretty well established among Christians, you had to hide it. So since the time is purely symbolic and basically arbitrary, since no one knows the actual day of the year he was born, and it's based on tradition and nothing more, what better time to do it than during Saturnalia, when everyone else was celebrating and so no one would notice? And what better day to pick than December 25th, when the birthday of the unconquerable sun could perhaps be thought of as the birthday of the unconquerable sun. Indeed, according to St. John Chrysostom, Bishop of Constantinople, writing in the late 4th or very early 5th centuries, in other words, just a couple of decades after Christianity had become the official religion of Rome, the Roman Church purposefully placed the keeping of Christmas between two popular folk festivals, I'm quoting him here, Saturnalia and the Calends of January, in order to give Christians something to celebrate about undisturbed while others were engaged in secular merrymaking. The Calends, and here's another aside, is the first day of the month, of each month in the Roman calendar, and in fact is the source of our word calendar. And yes, there was a popular folk festival in Rome during the first week of January, which was a significant part of the Roman solstice celebrations. By the year 354, 4 years after Pope Julius had declared it as such, December 25th had been accepted in Rome as the date of the Feast of Christ, or Christmas, Christmas. Gradually, most of the Christian church agreed. Once Christianity became the legal religion of Rome in 380, the church began appropriating what old pagan customs it could, with the result that the merry side of Saturnalia was gradually adopted and adapted to the observance of Christmas. And so that is why Christmas is on December 25th, because Christians hid within, then adopted, then adapted pagan celebrations of the winter solstice. By 1100, Christmas was the peak celebration of the year for all of Europe. But let me finish up by saying that even then, the idea was not universally accepted. Origen's conviction that celebrating the birth of a god was for pagans, not for Christians, persisted among conservative Christians for centuries, including among the separatists and Puritans who settled Plymouth and Boston in Massachusetts. They regarded Christmas as a pagan celebration with no biblical justification. Instead of Yuletide, Puritans called it Fool's Tide, which does at least prove that puns are not a recent invention. In fact, at one point, Boston had laws against Christmas. As an illustration of the attitude, we have the Journal of Plymouth Colony Governor William Bradford, who in the entry for 1621 recalled what he called a passage rather of mirth than of weight. I'm quoting him here. On the day called Christmas Day, the governor called him out to work as was used, but most of this new company, and here he's referring to a group of men who had arrived in November, the month before, November 1621, on a ship called Fortune. Most of this new company excused themselves and said it went against their consciences to work on that day. So the governor told them that if they made it a matter of conscience, he would spare them till they were better informed. So he led away the rest and left them. But when they came home at noon from their work, he found them at play in the street, openly, some pitching the barn, some at stool ball and other such like sports. So he went to them and took away their implements and said it was against his conscience that they should play and others work. If they made the keeping of it a matter of devotion, let them keep to their houses, but there should be no gaming or reveling in the streets. Since which time nothing's been attempted that way, at least openly. That last part, by the way, gets a little added significance when you realize that Bradford was writing this at about 1631 or 1632, about 10 years after the fact. And the outlawing of Christmas was not just here at home. In 1644, Great Britain's Puritan-dominated Parliament passed an ordinance which called for December 25th to be a day of solemn humiliation, and followed that up in 1647 by outright abolishing the feasts of Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun, the latter of which is known in the U.S. as Pentecost. The ban was not lifted until the restoration of the British Crown in 1660. Back in the colonies, as I already mentioned, Mass Bay Colony, that is Boston, banned observing Christmas altogether. That came in 1659, and that ban persisted for 22 years until 1681, and even then it was a governor appointed by the restored British monarchy who revoked it. And despite the lifting of the ban, the first recorded celebration of Christmas in Boston wasn't for another 5 years in 1686. And even for a good number of years thereafter, Thanksgiving remained the most important holiday in New England. Then in the wake of the Revolution, interest in Christmas across the former colonies faded because it was seen as a British holiday. In fact, Christmas did not again become a major holiday in the U.S. Until a religious revival in the early 1800s spurred renewed interest in the day, particularly in the South. As a result, it's generally agreed, it was more than 50 years after the Revolution before Alabama in 1836 became the first state to make the day a holiday. Even then, New England continued to lag behind. In Plymouth, the first time Christmas was even mentioned in one of the town's newspapers was, as far as anyone can determine, in 1625. As late as 1856, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote that the old Puritan feeling prevents Christmas from being a cheerful and hearty holiday in the region, but he added, we are in a transition state, which it proved to be because by 1860, by 1860, that same Plymouth paper, which is still being published, by the way, 198 years after it was founded, that same Plymouth paper was filled with ads for Christmas presents. And by the end of the 1800s, Christmas was as much a part of Plymouth as it had become for the rest of the century. The rest of the country, again, another little mistake that I'll correct, the rest of the country, which just goes to prove I need a break. And we are back. All right, so we're back with the natural follow-up, which is, why is January 1st New Year's Day? Because it wasn't always. So why? Well, in large part, the reason has to do with the convenience of the Roman Senate, a calendar almost no one uses anymore, and the stubbornness of tradition. The earliest recorded New Year's celebrations are believed to have been in Mesopotamia about 4,000 years ago. That is about 2000 BCE. The Babylonians began the year with the first new moon after the vernal equinox and greeted it with a multi-day celebration called Akitu. Now, this actually is a logical time to start the year, since the vernal equinox is the first day of spring in mid-March, and it's traditionally a time of beginnings, renewals, planting crops, the birth of new farm animals, and so on. Now, a lot of other ancient cultures all use different days than that, but essentially all of them had some kind of astronomical or astrological significance. For example, the Egyptians used the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which is the time when the star is rising just before sunrise. That's significant because Sirius is, again, the brightest star in the night sky of the northern hemisphere. This event occurs in what is, by our calendar, the middle of July, and it predicted the annual flooding of the Nile, which is so important to Egyptian agriculture. Persians used the vernal equinox, the Phoenicians the autumnal equinox, which is the first day of fall in the northern hemisphere, the Greeks used the winter solstice, and so on. All such choices carried some meaning beyond the day itself. January 1st doesn't have any such special meaning, so why January 1st? All right, we'll start by saying that an early Roman calendar designated March 1st as the first day of the year. That early Roman calendar was a lunar one based on phases of the moon. The problem is the average lunar month is about 29.5 days, and there's no way you can match that to a solar year of 365.25 days. You're going to be off by up to 12 days a year, and it's the solar year that drives the seasons. What's more, that lunar calendar consisted of 10 months and 304-day year and didn't even count the days between the end of December and the beginning of the year at the vernal equinox, apparently being designated as being March 1st. That calendar is reformed around 713 BCE to add the months of January and February, creating a year of 355 days, which is still 10 days short of the solar year. To correct this, the Romans from time to time inserted a leap month of about 22 days into February, which served to overcorrect the disparity between the calendar and the solar year, to give them some time before the disparity again became so great that they had to, put in another leap month. Next, according to general, but apparently not universal agreement among historians, in about 153 BCE, the Roman Senate moved the first day of the year to January 1st. That was because it was the beginning of the civil year. It was the day that newly elected Roman consuls took their seat of office, and it was felt to be just more convenient to have the civil year and the legal year begin on the same day. January is also a reasonable time because it was named for Janus, the Roman god of gates, doors, and beginnings. That is, the god of all transitions. And Janus actually had two faces, so we can see the past and the future simultaneously. Now, despite the attempts at correction, by the time of Julius Caesar, the calendar was seriously out of whack with the solar year. So in 46 BCE, Caesar introduced a new solar-based calendar of 365 days. Now, this Julian calendar, as it came to be called, also introduced the use of leap years to keep the calendar from drifting too far from the solar year. Remember, the solar year is about 365.25 days, so every 4 years, the calendar and the solar year would diverge by a day, which means it didn't take a lot of years before this difference became really noticeable. Add a day every 4 years, and it keeps the two more or less in line. By the way, the same Julian calendar also came with a decree that fixed January 1st as the first day of the year. Now, after the Roman Empire fell, the generally agreed year for that being 476, and Christianity had spread across Europe, the Catholic Church, which remember had previously adopted and adapted the Mary side of Saturnalia, now felt it was in a position to downplay such pagan and unchristian festivals as had come to surround the New Year in Rome. So in 562, the Second Council of Tours banned the use of January 1st as the first day of the new year. And remember, this is at a time in European history when the Church's authority in legal as well as religious matters was largely unquestioned. If the Church said do it, governments did it. As a result, in the Middle Ages in Europe, the official New Year started at different times in different places, including the Old Day from the Old Roman calendar of March 1st, March 25th, which is the Feast of the Annunciation, and right around the time of the vernal equinox, Easter, even though that was a different day every year, and December 25th, which again by then was the traditional birthday of Jesus. But remember, Julius Caesar had set January 1st as New Year's Day in 46 BCE, which means by the time the council acted, the practice of keeping that as the first day of the year had persisted for 613 years, with the result that a lot of people simply ignored the official day and just kept to the old one. Now, Julian calendar was also flawed because the solar year is actually a few minutes shorter than 365¼ days. So the use of leap years every 4 years slightly overcorrects the difference. A few minutes may not seem like a lot, but the fact is the error accumulates, and by the latter 1500s, the difference had grown to 10 days. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII oversaw the design of a new, more accurate calendar, which changed the rule of leap years such that only century years divisible by 400, not by 4, would be leap years. Thus, 2000 was a leap year, but 1900 wasn't, 2100 won't be. That still leaves a tiny overcorrection, but apparently it would take something like 3,000 years to build that up to a single day, so nobody actually cares, and we'll be using star dates by then anyway. More significantly for our story here, Pope Gregory apparently knew a losing battle when he saw one and surrendered to tradition, restoring January 1st as the official New Year's Day for the Church after 1,015 years. Catholic countries in Europe were quickly to adopt the calendar, with Spain, France, and Italy doing so the year it came out, but Protestant ones did so only gradually, suspicious that the Antichrist in Rome was trying to trick them into worshiping on the wrong days. Scotland, for example, didn't adopt the calendar for nearly 20 years. And England, which had used March 25th as the start of the year since sometime in the 1100s, didn't finally make the change from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar until 1752, 170 years later, by which time the disparity between the calendars had grown to 11 days. This was corrected by just simply removing 11 days from the 1752 calendar. Now, there are tales of riots breaking out with people claiming that they'd be 11 days shorter in life or that they lost 11 days of wages. While such sentiments existed, historians now are of the opinion that the story of riots is a myth. However, the change of calendar was an issue in the 1754 parliamentary election, so it's hard to credit the idea there were no protests of any sort. Anyway, that's it. January 1st is the first day of the year, not due to any special meaning or relevance of the date itself, but due to the convenience of the Roman Senate, the Julian calendar, which almost no one uses anymore, and the surrender of Pope Gregory XIII to the persistence of tradition. So in the spirit of Constantine, let me say Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Festivus. To all the atheists like me and all the pagans out there, Happy Winter Solstice. And to all of us, Happy Holidays and Happy New Year. Like the man in the story said, we are halfway out of the dark. See you in 2 weeks. Peace.